Hello and good evening. I'm Catherine Squires, the Interim Dean at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. I would like to welcome you to the inaugural event in our Swain Climate Policy Series. This series was made possible by a friend of the Humphrey School and the University of Minnesota, someone who is known all throughout our state, Mr. Tom Swain. This year, Tom turned 100 years old. And rather than looking backward at his life, Tom is looking ahead at the future of our planet, the fate of his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Tom came to us wanting to enlist his fellow citizens to find solutions to take action to reduce the climate threat. We at the Humphrey School knew we could answer his call to help develop the Swain Climate Policy Series, backed by our expertise in public issues that emerge at the intersection of science, technology, the environment, and society. This week and throughout the year, we are partnering with the university's Institute on the Environment to promote ways each of us can become part of the solution through policy and advocacy. We are thrilled you have joined us this evening, and we invite you to participate in other events happening this week, which are listed on our website. And please continue to look for upcoming opportunities to get involved with the Swain climate policy effort. And now I would like to introduce the president of the University of Minnesota, Joan Gable.
Good evening, I'm Joan Gable, President of the University of Minnesota. Welcome to each of you for this very important and special event. Tonight, you will hear from former Vice President Al Gore, who I actually first met as a law student when he was on the campaign trail. But in the decades since, he's been a tireless and impactful advocate in informing the world around the dangers of the global climate crisis. And we're honored that he's joining us and sharing his insights tonight. Friends, we see the harsh realities of climate change all around us. Here in the Midwest this summer, wildfires and smoke impacted our health and threatened treasured places like the Boundary Waters. Specific to the Twin Cities, we experienced severe droughts, while other places throughout the state and region faced devastating flooding. And this isn't just here. We know that climate change is a global issue and that everyone has a role to play. At the University of Minnesota, we know that the time is now, and we're committed to taking robust action through our system-wide strategic plan, MPACT 2025, and our work to build a fully sustainable future, to demonstrate state and worldwide leadership in sustainability around environmental teaching, learning, and convening, to advancing the Sustainable Development Goals, and to develop next-generation climate action plans on each of our campuses and across our system, for which I recently charged our Senior Vice President for Finance and Operations, Myron Franz, and Interim Vice President for Research, Michael Oakes, to develop and implement. And through these endeavors, we're proud of the way our research and innovation are helping to bring new technology, practices, and methods to the private sector to address these critical issues. How our service and engagement is advancing partnerships with the private sector through MBOLD and the Sustainable Growth Coalition, and with international counterparts through the Climate Smart Municipalities Program and the Aurora Network. And how right here at home, our university system has achieved a 47% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions since 2008. Our UMN Morris campus recently achieved carbon neutrality in electricity, and how we've taken important steps to emphasize sustainability in our university endowment, from investment in wind and solar farms that provide power to over 5 million households, to being the co-founding anchor investor in a low-carbon index fund. And while we're proud of all we've accomplished, we know there is more work to do. In this spirit, I'm calling on all members of our university family to join us in meeting the climate crisis and to engage in this important work, including to participate in innovative sustainability programs launching from new faculty-student sustainability committees. Together, we can be leaders, igniting more hope through discovery, outreach, and engagement, much like those who made tonight possible, like the Humphrey School, the Institute on the Environment, and my friend Tom Swain, who has called the climate crisis the biggest, most critical issue that humankind faces today. Our sincere gratitude to trailblazers like Tom Swain, to Vice President Gore, and to all those who are steadily working through as though our planet depends on it. Thank you.
Thank you, President Gable. Hello, everyone. I'm Jessica Hellman, Director of the Institute on the Environment at the University of Minnesota. IonE, as we call it, is a place of interdisciplinary scholarship and education serving the entire U of M. Because we're committed to building leaders at all stages and ages, IonE is honored to be part of tonight's event and other events of Climate Week with the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Now, in addition to Institute Director, I'm also a climate scientist and a professor, and I bring those hats to the role of moderator this evening. So let's start the show. You're all in for a real treat. We'll start with some short remarks from this evening's guest, Vice President Al Gore, and then we'll have a conversation driven by questions from U of M students. But to introduce our speaker, I'd like to turn the mic over to my colleague, Gabe Chan, energy scholar and affiliate of the Institute on the Environment and associate professor in the Humphrey School. Gabe.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm Gabe Chan, an associate professor at the Humphrey School. 15 years ago, though, I was a college student and deeply uncertain about what I wanted to major in. High school had convinced me I could solve math problems and succeed in classes, but none of that felt like it meant anything. One evening my sophomore year, after a day of taking required core classes and going to sports practice, I was wandering the halls, probably on my way to find a cheap burrito or something like that, when I walked past one of the lecture halls that was hosting a weekly movie night, and I was in the mood to procrastinate. So I dropped in to catch whatever the movie the student club was playing that evening. And little did I know that my life would soon take an irreversible turn. I walked in halfway through An Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore's 2006 documentary about the climate crisis. I caught glimpses of melting ice caps I had never seen before, tales of mass migration and endangered species, and quite honestly, I felt overwhelmed. It was a powerful tale about a world we were headed toward, and I didn't see how getting back to work on my math problem set was ever going to make a difference. But then something changed. Once the movie ended, a professor came up and looked out to all of us, 17, 18-year-olds, and said, if we're going to make a difference in the problems that Al Gore is describing, it's going to be because you all are going to make that difference. It was at that moment that I looked inward and asked myself what I could do to prevent the world of catastrophic climate change that An Inconvenient Truth described. I pulled an all-nighter that night and learned everything I could about global warming. And the next morning, I changed my major to earth sciences and political sciences, and I've never looked back. And that brings me to today, when I have the great honor of introducing Vice President Al Gore to the University of Minnesota. Vice President Gore is the founder of the Climate Reality Project, a nonprofit that is devoted to solving the climate crisis. He's authored several books on climate change, including the #1 New York Times bestseller, An Inconvenient Truth, as well as an inconvenient sequel, Truth to Power. And he's here tonight to talk with us about how we can be part of the climate solution and where we can go from here. So as I come to you all this evening, I want to address specifically the younger people in the audience to deliver the same message that was delivered to me. If we're going to make a difference in the problems that Al Gore is about to describe to us this evening, it's because you all are going to make that difference. With that, welcome Vice President Al Gore.
Thank you so much for a wonderful introduction, Professor Chan. That story is very moving, and I'm grateful to you for not just the introduction, but for the life path you've chosen. In any case, hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be joining you this evening to inaugurate the first ever Swain Climate Policy Lecture. And before I begin, I want to thank President Joan Gable and Dean Catherine Squires for inviting me to join you today and for helping to drive the University of Minnesota's commitment to sustainability. I also, of course, want to acknowledge the namesake of this lecture series, Thomas Swain. We visited on the screen a little bit before this event. And first of all, let me congratulate you, sir, on a century of a remarkable life and on your incredible resume of accomplishments. I won't list them all, but just let me say that we need more people like you in public service. And I hope all of you who are students who are joining us today will be inspired by Mr. Swain's example, particularly on an issue as important as the climate crisis. We need more people like you drawing focus to the action needed to address what is overwhelmingly the greatest challenge of our time. So let us begin here with the challenge. As you are all keenly aware, the devastating impacts of the climate crisis continue to worsen faster than we have yet begun to implement the solutions. We have the solutions, but we've got to move faster. And even so, it can still be difficult for any of us to wrap our minds around the truly unprecedented nature of this very current and growing threat. For example, our sky, when you go outside on a clear day and look up, seems like a vast and limitless expanse if you're looking up from the ground. But in truth, the sky is an extremely thin shell surrounding our planet. The image behind me is a picture of that thin shell taken from the International Space Station. It's so thin that if you could drive a car straight up in the air at interstate highway speeds, you'd reach the top of the sky in about 5 minutes. And yet, every single day, we are spewing 162 million tons of man-made global warming pollution into that thin shell of atmosphere as if it's an open sewer. And it accumulates there. And the extra heat energy trapped by all of the accumulated greenhouse gas pollution is equal to what would be released by 600,000 Hiroshima-class atomic bombs exploding on Earth every single day. The consequences of this extraordinary extra amount of heat energy are all around us. 2020 was the planet's warmest year on record, according to NASA. The 7 hottest years of all have been the past 7 years, rounding out the hottest decade that's ever been recorded with instruments. As a result, we are seeing a litany of impacts: stronger storms, bigger downpours, rain bombs they're being called now, more destructive floods and mudslides, deeper and longer droughts, crop failures, strengthening wildfires, spreading tropical diseases, melting ice and the consequent sea level rise, acidification of the oceans, loss of living species, and so much more. This summer in the United States, climate-driven extreme weather disasters hit areas where 1 in 3 Americans live. A new report issued a few weeks ago found that worldwide, 85% of the entire global population has already been impacted by the climate crisis in some way over the course of their lifetimes. As temperatures rise, these impacts take a number of different forms. Here in the U.S., an historic drought across the western part of North America has helped to fuel vicious wildfires. In fact, 6 of the 7 largest fires on record in California history have occurred in the past 14 months alone. In addition to causing destruction where they burn, the air pollution from these fires put lives at risk across the country. In fact, last year, even as air pollution from the burning of fossil fuels declined during the pandemic, the overall amount of particulate pollution in the U.S. is estimated to have increased 7%, in part due to last year's record-breaking fire season. Scientists are now finding that the health effects of air pollution from fires are uniquely damaging. And then there's the impact of rising temperatures on our ocean. 93% of all that extra heat energy trapped by the human-caused global warming pollution goes into the ocean. And that's not only a problem for marine species, with coral reefs being one of the best-known examples, but ocean waters also fuel stronger hurricanes and typhoons and strengthen the atmospheric rivers that then dump huge amounts of precipitation along their paths. We saw this phenomenon play out in California this past weekend, where an atmospheric river dumped enormous amounts of precipitation. Sacramento, for example, set an all-time 24-hour rainfall record on Sunday with 5.5 inches of rain, beating the previous record set way back in the previous century. That's the equivalent amount of rain that would normally fall in the area over the course of 2.5 months. Similarly, Hurricane Ida grew into a monster storm thanks to the abnormally warm waters in the Gulf of Mexico, 7 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than normal. That storm battered the Gulf states, as is typical, hitting communities of color and poor communities most of all. And then Hurricane Ida continued its path of destruction across the eastern United States, causing massive downpours and flooding that led to at least 50 deaths in the Northeast. In total, extreme weather disasters cost the global economy $2.5 trillion over the last decade, an increase of almost $1 trillion over the preceding decade. And globally, extreme rainfall events are now occurring 4 times more often than they did back in 1980. The human and economic toll of inaction is rising each and every day. So clearly, the need to act has never been more urgent. And while it's easy to feel overwhelmed at times at the dire impacts that we face, I have an enormous amount of hope about our future. Though the global approach to climate policy has been piecemeal at best over the past few decades, we're seeing a significant shift in the market for decarbonization thanks to advances in innovative new technologies and targeted incentives for renewables in most of the key markets. As a result, we're now in the early stages of a sustainability revolution, driven in part by machine learning, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, and astonishing advances in biotechnology, all of which make up the potential to completely reshape our world for the better by transforming our relationship to businesses, the environment, and to one another. This global sustainability revolution has the scale and impact of the Industrial Revolution coupled with the speed of the digital revolution. The rapid cost reduction curves for clean solar and wind, for batteries, electric vehicles, and for hundreds of less well-known but dramatic efficiency improvements are already profoundly reshaping the economics of sustainability. Renewable energy is an incredible example. Last year, calendar year 2020, 90% of all of the newly installed electricity production worldwide was from renewables, most all of it from solar and wind. And in the decade ahead, the International Energy Agency projects that that percentage is going to rise to 95% and stay there. And many local, regional, and national jurisdictions are now mandating that renewables provide 100% of their electricity. Around the globe, the market has been transformed with dizzying speed. Here's an example. In 2014, just 1 year before the Paris Agreement was reached, solar and wind electricity was cheaper than the electricity from new coal and gas plants in only 1% of the world. As of 2019, 5 years later, solar and wind were the cheapest sources of new electricity in more than 2/3 of the world. And in the next 3 years, it'll be cheaper in virtually 100% of the world. In many geographies, the ever-increasing cost advantages of clean energy are leading to the replacement and early retirement of existing coal and gas facilities, even when they have decades of useful life remaining. Countries like Bangladesh and Vietnam are now canceling their plans to build new coal plants and are instead moving to clean energy. For 60% of all the coal plants around the world, it's already cheaper right now to just shut them down right away and replace them with new solar and wind. In the European Union, that's the case for over 90% of the existing coal plants, and it will be true for nearly all coal plants in the world by the end of this decade. Now, of course, the impact of the sustainability revolution reaches far beyond changes in the electricity sector. It's already widespread across all sectors of the economy. Companies are reinventing transportation, for example. Electric cars are now approaching cost competitiveness with gas guzzlers. This trend is going to pick up considerable momentum next year when many EV model sizes will become cheaper than their internal combustion counterparts. And over the next 3 to 4 years, all model sizes will be cheaper in the EV version than in the internal combustion engine version. Innovation in the agricultural sector is also poised to play a significant role in reducing emissions. In their recent special report on land and climate, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, told us that the food system is responsible for 25 to 30% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. That's once you consider not only crop and livestock activities, but also land use and land use change, including deforestation and the full range of supply chain activities, including food waste, which is a big issue. A shift in how we care for land around the world can help enable agriculture and other sectors to actually sequester a substantial amount of CO2 emissions and become part of the solution to the climate crisis instead of remaining part of the problem. Natural climate solutions like sustainable forestry and regenerative agriculture can not only help protect our natural world and represent major opportunities for emissions reductions, they can also provide other important co-benefits, including job creation, resiliency for farmers, protection of biodiversity, improvement of fresh water quality and availability, and much more. And this is what's needed, a complete rethink of the relationships between business, investors, markets, governments, and all of us, one another. Embracing the global sustainability revolution is the best way to grow our economy for the long run in a sustainable way, tap into markets of the future, and create tens of millions of good and green jobs. These investments also have significant co-benefits, including reductions in deadly particulate air pollution. That's the co-pollution that also is emitted when you burn fossil fuels. And also they can address the crisis of hyper inequality in our economy all around the world. Efforts to retrofit lower income households will reduce household energy burdens, thereby helping to alleviate poverty. Upgrading the electricity grid to provide additional solar and wind power capacity and expanding its reach into rural communities can help boost access to telehealth, education, and job opportunities that have previously been out of reach in many rural areas. But unfortunately, while there was significant talk of making our recovery from COVID-19 a green recovery, so far that recovery has been decidedly unsustainable. After the largest ever decline in emissions due to the pandemic last year, the International Energy Agency, or IEA, projects that emissions will actually rebound in this year, 2021, and end up growing by 5%. So indeed, we are continuing to move in the wrong direction, even though we're gaining some momentum for change. And that's why the outcome of next week's global climate talks in Glasgow, COP26, are so important. Nearly 6 years ago in Paris, the global community committed to a bold target to hold the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This year in Glasgow, nations must commit to implementing the plans that will allow us to keep that goal within reach. We must dramatically reduce emissions and quickly. Many nations have made pledges to reach net zero by 2050, and that's great, but truly it's the actions we take in this decade right now that are the most critical if we want to avert the catastrophic impacts of the climate crisis, and we must. So we need to hold our leaders accountable, and we need them to commit to bold action in the near term. I must say I'm incredibly proud of President Biden's leadership on this issue. He's already shown the seriousness of his commitment to climate action, both at home and on the world stage. Within his first 100 days in office, President Biden pledged to cut U.S. emissions in half or more by 2030. And in doing so, he has sent a strong signal to the global community that significant emissions reductions by 2030 are not only necessary, but they're imminently achievable. Investments in upgrading our energy, our buildings, our transportation infrastructure will capitalize on the sustainability revolution that's underway and put our country on a path to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Of course, some of his proposed investments do face a difficult challenge in Congress, but there's good news today. Just an hour ago, the news that the climate provisions have held firm, almost completely surviving the negotiations thus far. And ultimately, these proposals have the support of a majority of the American people from both of our political parties. In fact, Americans' concern about the climate crisis is now at an all-time high, rising 6 percentage points just in the last 6 months. And for the first time ever, the majority of Americans acknowledge that people in this country are right now being harmed by global warming. So the outpouring of attention to the climate crisis and the increase in activism in recent years, led in large part by our youngest generation, has pushed us to a political tipping point. World leaders are finally beginning to put plans behind their words, and I'm encouraged by the actions that major governments have already announced in the run-up to COP26. Countries that have committed to net zero targets account now for 61% of all global emissions. And leaders are setting strong intermediate targets as well. For example, the UK, hosting the conference, has pledged to reduce emissions by 68% before 2030. Germany has pledged a 65% reduction by 2030. The European Union as a whole plans to cut emissions by at least 55% by 2030, and Japan is also pursuing a cut of up to 50% this decade. And the recent announcement from President Xi of China to completely end their financing of overseas coal plants, following in the footsteps of the G7 earlier this summer, is a significant signal to global markets that the era of coal is now finally coming to a close. But many other countries must significantly step up their ambition going into COP26. The United Nations issued a report recently showing that even with current pledges, emissions are projected to actually increase by 16% by 2030. So we need more. And that just flies in the face of scientific expertise, which says that we need to cut emissions in half by 2030 in order to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. The time for celebrating vague, distant net zero goals has passed. We need an economy-wide effort to mobilize against this crisis. Fortunately, more and more people around the globe have now awakened to both the urgency and the opportunity of the climate crisis. We need to turn that fresh awareness into action that holds leaders accountable to their pledges. Indeed, the progress that we've seen recently from businesses to governments to every corner of society is actually thanks in part to the incredible climate activism that we've seen growing over the past few years. Young leaders like Greta Thunberg of Sweden, Alexandria Villaseñor here in the United States, and by the way, she trained with Climate Reality in Minneapolis in 2019, and leaders like Vanessa Nakate in Uganda. They have inspired not only their own generation to act, they've helped remove the blinders that so many in the older generations have apparently been wearing and avoiding the confrontation they need with this growing crisis. I've been working on this issue for a long time, and I know that the challenge of solving the climate crisis can at times seem incredibly daunting. But as progress over the last few years has shown, things can change very quickly. When the culture shifts, when consciousness changes, then everything else can change rapidly, faster than people think it can. That's what has to happen with the conversation about the climate crisis. And I'm of the strong belief that we are winning this conversation. I know that many of you are here tuning into this event because you want to be a part of something larger than yourselves. So I would end by challenging all of you to aim high and aim in that direction. These are the times when it is a privilege to have the opportunity to do good and historic things, to do really big things. I firmly believe that we are right now in a moment that future historians will look back on and see as a turning point for human civilization. But they'll see that and describe it that way only if we use all of the tools in our toolkit to drive the change that's so urgently needed right now. The global energy transformation is influenced by the ambition of large public and private sector actors, and those actors in turn are directly influenced by the passion and the power of your actions. So the future is in your hands. Thank you again for having me here today. I'm excited to continue this conversation and answer some of your questions. So before I turn it over to you, Jessica, let me just say that for anyone who doubts that we have the political will to meet this challenge, always remember that political will is itself a renewable resource. Thank you for hosting today's conversation. Jessica, I'm so pleased to be here with you, and I can't wait to hear from your students. Thank you.
Vice President Gore. We really, really appreciate your leadership, your experience, and your willingness to engage with us this evening. We really hear you on the scale of climate change and its profound consequences, but also on the opportunity to draw on the inspiration that comes from the sustainability revolution, as you describe it, the co-benefits that come from that revolution, and how quickly things can change. So we have questions from 4 students who would like to dig into that. They'd like to talk with you about how to do that work, how they can make a difference, and how to keep going in the face of uncertainty and headwinds, how to do that kind of accountability that you described. So I had the opportunity to meet with all of these students to hear firsthand the things they're doing and they're wondering about. They want to ask you about what matters and what all of us should be doing to make a difference. So here we go. Okay, our first question comes from Ruby DeBellis. And Ruby has a question about the responsibility of the United States on the global stage.
My name is Ruby DeBellis, and I'm a first-year master's student at the Humphrey Science, Technology, and Environmental Policy Program. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees released data showing that climate change-related disasters have displaced 21.5 million people since 2010. This disproportionately affects developing nations, like the Philippines, where I have lived. With the United States being responsible for over 1/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions, what responsibility does the United States have in rehabilitating damaged ecosystems, preventing displacement, and accommodating climate refugees?
That's a great question. And indeed, it's a question that world leaders have been grappling with for the last few decades. And to speak to your point about climate refugees, in addition to those who have already been displaced by the climate crisis, the world could see up to 1 billion climate refugees in the balance of this century. The flows of climate refugees have unfortunately already awoken xenophobia in some of the developed nations to which they're migrating in growing numbers. Think about Hungary, for example. And there is already evidence in some wealthy nations that this is one of the things that has contributed to the disturbing rise of populist authoritarianism. So there's no doubt, for a lot of reasons, that further action is needed to protect refugees and work to build the resilience of developing nations to the impacts of the climate crisis that we can't avoid. There's also no doubt that many of the nations that have contributed the least to causing the climate crisis are the ones experiencing some of its worst impacts. Wealthier nations that have historically been the largest emitters of greenhouse gases, like the US, have an obligation to provide climate finance to developing nations to help them not only build resilience, but also to support the swift deployment of the mature solutions like clean energy, the zero carbon solutions across industries. In fact, world leaders have committed to providing this funding. In 2009, back at the negotiations on climate in Copenhagen, developed countries made a commitment to jointly mobilize $100 billion a year in climate finance to developing nations by 2020. Now, unfortunately, world leaders have not yet fully met that commitment, but I'm glad to see that under President Biden, the United States has renewed our commitment as a nation to providing this essential funding. He's pledged to double the U.S. contribution, which was a very strong policy signal to other wealthier nations that they need to step up their own pledges. And just yesterday, finance ministers, before their meeting in Glasgow, issued a delivery plan to actually meet the $100 billion goal and made important progress toward fulfilling this promise. However, they acknowledge that it's going to be another 2 years before that commitment is fully met. They're up to over $80 billion now. But we know that the climate crisis is not waiting. It's wreaking havoc around the world right now. So both the public sector and the private sector must dramatically ramp up their commitments to developing nations. And I'm optimistic that that will happen.
Great. Thank you so much. We're all looking forward, I know, to hearing what comes out of the Glasgow negotiations, and you point to the importance of both meeting our emission reduction targets and also our commitments to helping developing countries confront climate challenges that they weren't ultimately responsible for, or much less so than in the developed world. Our next question comes from our Morris campus, where Dylan Young has a question that addresses grassroots activism.
Hi, my name is Dylan Young. I am a junior at the University of Minnesota Morris, and I study political science, English, and a minor in Native American Studies. I am also a member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe. Right now, people around the world, including indigenous water protectors here in Minnesota, are organizing their communities to save our environment. As you have said yourself, grassroots activists are leaders in the fight against climate change. What lessons can their efforts teach us about taking effective action and finding solutions to climate change?
So much for another great question, Dylan. That is really a good one. And so first, let me say, specifically with respect to indigenous leadership, there's so much we can and must learn from indigenous leaders who are among humanity's strongest advocates for and stewards of our planet. Indeed, while indigenous peoples comprise roughly 6% of the global population, they care for lands that are home to an astounding 80% of the world's biodiversity. I've been incredibly inspired by the grassroots leadership of indigenous communities here in the United States in standing up to oil and gas companies trying to build dangerous fossil fuel pipelines over sacred land and endangering vital water supplies. From the Keystone XL, which I know the Rosebud Sioux were very active in stopping, congratulations, to the Dakota Access Pipeline, and now Line 3. In all cases, indigenous voices have shepherded an effective playbook for grassroots activism that has sparked activism across the country. We've seen significant, though hard-fought, success in stopping some of these projects in just the past few years. Others remain to be stopped. One thing we must do to continue this progress in the United States and around the world is to ensure that indigenous and local communities have prioritized access to decision-making spaces, legal rights to their territories, and protection from harmful extractive industries. It's also important to recognize that grassroots activism takes persistence. Change does not happen overnight. It requires a dedicated and diverse collaborative effort. By the way, I was involved in a recent effort to stop the Byhalia pipeline, which would have run through a 97% Black neighborhood in southwest Memphis, a freedmen's community established in 1865. But the community stood up against that project, and they won overwhelmingly. They did so by bringing together the community that would suffer the impacts and lobbying their elected officials, working with lawyers on legal challenges, and elevating the profile of the fight through social media and press outreach. They formed a coalition of advocates who pursued every possible avenue to prevent the construction of that reckless, racist ripoff, and they won. Public pressure and advocacy has become more and more effective on the climate issue in recent years. So my most important word of advice to all of you is to keep it up. Keep using your voices, use your vote, use your choices as consumers and in society to drive the essential transition to a sustainable future, and listen to and learn from the indigenous communities.
I'm so glad you addressed that, the keep going and using your voice. I know from talking to Dylan that this question of how you keep persisting in the face of setbacks, you referenced grassroots activism often being successful. Sometimes it isn't. Do you have advice for students like Dylan who are investing a lot of time and effort into that activism and sometimes it doesn't work out? How does he keep going? Do you have further thoughts on that, Mr. Gore?
Well, there's a famous law in economics named after the late economist Rudy Dornbush. And the Dornbush law says things take longer to happen than you think they will, but then they happen faster than you thought they could. And if you think back on the great morally based movements of the past, whether it's the civil rights movement in our country or women's suffrage or the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, the more recent thrilling victories for liberation of gay and lesbian communities, in all of those movements, there were times when it seemed like it might be impossible, seemed like it might take forever, but they kept going. Remember, Nelson Mandela said famously, "It always seems impossible until it's done." We're going to win this. The question is whether we'll win it in time. So keep going. We need you, and thank you for your stamina and your persistence and determination.
That's great. All right, our third question comes from Twin Cities student Bemnet Kika, and she has a question that is rooted in her community.
Hello, my name is Bemna Kika, and I am a senior at the University of Minnesota pursuing an individualized degree in health services management and public health. I currently live by the East Phillips neighborhood in Minneapolis, which is a diverse community that is largely made up of Hispanic, Native American, and African American residents. Children here suffer from the highest rates of asthma and lead poisoning hospitalizations in the state of Minnesota due to the ongoing issue of environmental injustice. As the climate crisis continues to worsen, communities of color have been and are expected to continue to get hit the hardest. What tangible steps can the U.S. take to better the health outcomes and address the disproportionate impact that climate change has had on communities of color?
Oh, great question. And let me start by saying unequivocally, we cannot have climate justice without racial justice. We can and must have both. They're intertwined. In fact, the pandemic has underscored just how interconnected these issues are. We know that exposure to air pollution is a precondition that raises the death rate from COVID-19. And we know that low-income communities and communities of color have faced disproportionate impacts from both the COVID-19 pandemic and the legacy of environmental racism that has led to the construction of some of the dirtiest fossil fuel facilities in or near communities of color, which are way more likely to be downwind from the smokestacks and downstream from the hazardous waste flows. You mentioned the examples of these disparities that you've seen in Minnesota, but I'm sure you know full well this is a national problem. 13.4% of African American children have asthma compared to 7.3% of white children. And the death rate from asthma is 10 times higher for Black children than from the white community's children. And more than 1 million African Americans live in areas where toxic air pollution from natural gas facilities is so high that the cancer risk from this industry way exceeds the EPA levels of concern. But a just transition away from fossil fuels provides an incredible opportunity to deliver on the promise of environmental justice. As we invest in the solutions to the climate crisis, we simply must ensure that those solutions are deployed equitably. President Biden has proposed an initiative known as Justice 40, which would require that 40% of all the spending on clean energy and the environment be targeted to the frontline communities that have historically lacked those investments. We need our elected officials to follow through on that proposal. Ultimately, doing so will help to create millions of jobs all across the country and advance a more just future for the planet.
Ray, we're very interested in the Justice 40 in the communities that Bemnit was describing and for the benefit of all of us. So we'll go to our last question, which comes from Amethyst O'Connell.
Hello, Mr. Gore. I'm Amethyst O'Connell, an electrical engineering major on the Twin Cities campus. We are currently on track to hit an average 1.5 degrees Celsius increase by 2034 if something huge isn't done. As a STEM major, that date is in my Google Calendar. My peers and I, we fear that the burden of climate change falls on us alone to invent like our lives depend on it. And yet, we've invented incredible innovations already. We can't out-tech politics. What specific areas should we, the next generation of engineers, focus our efforts on to help as many people as possible?
Well, Amethyst, another great question, and you're exactly right that we've already made huge strides to harness science and technology to address the climate crisis. And as I mentioned previously, we have the solutions available to us today. Now we need to muster the political will to implement those solutions. As you mentioned, the clock is running out. The action we take within this decade will determine whether we are able to limit global temperature increases to 1.5 C. There's no time for delay, but even today, many people don't realize or don't believe that we can take action to deploy these solutions without incredible costs. But the truth is we can. They save us money. They create jobs. They make our environment cleaner. They give us hope. And as I mentioned in my talk, the cost of solar and wind energy continues to decline rapidly. It's almost like Moore's Law, stunning cost reduction curves. And in most countries around the world, it is already cheaper and more effective to deploy renewables than it is to continue relying on the dirty and dangerous fossil fuels. So I would encourage you and your peers to use your voices and your expertise in technological innovation to win the conversation about climate solutions, to win it with your friends, your family, your peers, and of course with policymakers. You also have an incredibly important role to play within any organization that you're part of. So do your research to understand whether your employer or the school you attend or the companies where you shop have sustainability plans that meet your standards. If they don't, help them create a better one. If they do, make sure you're holding them accountable to actually reaching those goals. It's important for leaders to understand that the burden cannot be placed on your generation alone to solve the climate crisis. We need those in power now to step up and meet this moment. There's simply no doubt that we need you to continue to innovate. There's still a lot of work that's needed, a lot of work we can do to increase energy efficiency, to develop new sustainable materials, and to power our future. But with the solutions we have in hand today, it's up to those in decision-making positions to take concrete steps to reach a net zero future. And let me point out, I remember back when I was 13 years old, I remember when President John Kennedy made his inspiring goal known to put a person on the moon, bring him back safely in 10 years. And I remember the adults of that day and time included many who said, oh, that's a waste of money. That's an unwise commitment. We may not even be able to do it. But 8 years and 2 months later, Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. And the moment he did so, there was a great cheer that went up in Mission Control, that big room in Houston where NASA's Mission Control is. And the average age of the systems engineers in that room was 26, which means their average age when they heard that challenge was 18. And they made the decision, as you're doing, to get the skills they needed to be a part of successfully meeting that challenge. And that's the response I'm hearing and seeing from young people all across the United States and the world. And it's not partisan. There are 55 colleges where the young Republican clubs have joined together to petition the National Republican Committee to change their position on climate, lest they lose that whole generation. A majority of Republicans as well as Democrats now support action to solve the climate crisis. We have a situation in our politics today where big money plays too big a role, and the money from the fossil fuel polluters and their lobbyists has held up action. It's more complicated than that, but that's really and truly the main obstacle that we have to overcome. And it shouldn't be as hard as it is for activists to clear the bar and persuade them to start implementing these solutions. But we need to clear that bar. And that means that all of you who may be listening to my voice now, either in person or online, I'm here not just to join this wonderful symposium and give you facts and figures. I'm here to recruit you. We need your help. Please become a part of what is emerging as the greatest morally based social movement in all of history. We can win this. We will win this. We need your help to do it. Thank you very much.
Mr. Gore, if I can ask you a follow-up on that. In Amethyst's question, I hear them asking about collaborating across STEM fields. Thinking back to Dylan, our poli-sci major, we're trying to build a future where systems are important and people need to think across technology and policy. And as you say, partisan differences too. Do you have thoughts for our students about getting outside their disciplinary boundaries and collaborating in ways that help to bring about change and accelerate, say, the rate of technology adoption or other approaches to tackling climate change?
Absolutely. There's an old cliche that there's strength in numbers. And so reach out and join with others, regardless of what field of concentration they're in your school or what their occupation might be. Join together and you can have a bigger influence that way. And you can draw on the unique and different knowledge and skills and talents of people from all walks of life to build a diverse and powerful coalition. Our democracy has always depended on what some people call the wisdom of crowds or collective intelligence. And when there is a shared commitment, for example, the commitment to solve the climate crisis, then everybody's unique point of view, everybody's unique perspective and skill set can make a tremendous difference when you join together in a common effort to bring about this system change in our world. We need to change our politics. We need to reform the way our markets work. We need to rapidly deploy these new clean technologies. And we need to convince more and more people to join this movement. Our survival as a civilization depends upon it. But don't be vulnerable to despair. We don't have time for despair. There's some people that just go from denial to despair without pausing on the intermediate step of joining together to actually solve the crisis. And let me conclude with some very optimistic and hopeful news that came out of the latest IPCC report in August. It had dire warnings for us. The scientists are clearer than ever. We've just got to change. We should have listened to the pandemic experts when they warned us. Now that the climate experts have been warning us for longer of even worse consequences, we need to listen to them. But we now have the opportunity to really solve this crisis, because here's what comes out of this latest report. Once we reach net zero, then the Earth's temperature will stop going up with a lag time of as little as 3 to 5 years. It's like there's a switch that we can flip, but the switch is so big we all have to put our shoulders to it to flip it over, and we're almost there. Here's another hopeful finding. Once we reach net zero, half of all the human-caused CO2 in the atmosphere will fall out of the atmosphere and be absorbed by the upper ocean and the vegetation within as little as 25 to 30 years. And the healing process will begin. It'll take some time, and regrettably, some damage has been done. Regrettably, some of that may not be recoverable. But the truly catastrophic impacts can still be prevented, and we can slow the pace of those things that we can't change, and we can adapt to them. But it requires action now. There are dangerous negative tipping points out there that we can't cross. And so doing that now and having the global emissions by 2030, getting to net zero by 2050, that's the pathway to secure the future of humanity. And we need all of you to participate in reaching it.
We all have a role to play. There is reason to be hopeful. I also think getting to contribute to the climate crisis as a scientist, as an educator, as a citizen is also a tremendous calling. It's a wonderful privilege and opportunity to work on something that's so important. And we're so grateful, Vice President Gore, that you would come and discuss these really important issues with us and be an inspiration to our whole university community as we tackle this issue together. And importantly, I really want to thank our 4 students for their really thoughtful questions this evening. And I hope, Mr. Gore, that you can see how committed we are here in the Midwest and in Minnesota to lead the way to a clean and sustainable future. We do want to play our part. And as you can hear, our students are ready to follow truth, knowledge, and justice toward what is possible, as you described it, and also what's right. So thank you. You've also engaged in an intergenerational conversation with us about climate change, because not only do we need to educate and prepare young people, and as you say, a lot of responsibility falls on their shoulder, but we have a duty to leave a viable planet for them to steward. So to cap this evening's dialogue, I want to welcome lifelong Minnesota public servant, Tom Swain, to share some parting words, again with my colleague, Gabe Chan.
Hello. Again, I'm Tom Swain. Thanks all of you for tuning in, and especially thank you to Vice President Gore for a superb message and for being with us. Thanks also to the Swain Climate Policy Series donors who responded to our call to actions. And also thanks to the Humphrey School and the Institute on the Environment for grabbing this ball and running with it. They are making the University of Minnesota a leader in this fight against climate change. A few months ago, I turned 100. That's a bunch of numbers. I've done a lot of things through the years in government, higher education, business, and the community. I don't think anything I've done is more important than what we're doing tonight, drawing attention to the need to take big steps now to mitigate climate change. I'm inspired by younger people who already are taking action. They're demanding that lawmakers act to prevent the worst effects of climate change. We older folks ought to join them. We need to make sure their voices are heard. We need to insist on action by everyone, not just individuals, but government and industry. The time is now. There is nothing else more urgent. I have great hope that we can convert the worst of the damage that climate change can do. We must, if we want our children and grandchildren to live safe and secure lives on this planet. I urge each of you to be an active citizen. Please vote, and when you do, vote for candidates who commit to do something now about climate change. Then make your voice heard after the election and hold your elected representative, yes, to account. I've seen in my lifetime that there's great power in democracy. We need to use that power as fully as possible now. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you so much for bringing this event to the Humphrey School, your resolve to address the climate crisis, and for the trust you've put in us at the University of Minnesota, the Humphrey School, and the Institute on the Environment. That means so much to all of us here. In addition to tonight's event, we have additional events coming up this week as part of the university's Climate Week. Tomorrow morning, we'll be hosting a coffee chat to reflect on this evening's programming. And then in the afternoon tomorrow, we'll be hosting students from across the University of Minnesota campuses to organize and brainstorm how our continued work on climate change can move forward. And then on Thursday, we'll be hosting an event with Climate Generation and members of our delegation heading to Glasgow for the United Nations climate negotiations next week. And then on Friday, we'll be hosting an afternoon of sustainability board games. To learn more about these and other Climate Week's events that are part of the Swain Climate Policy Series, please visit hhh.umn.edu. And as we wrap up here this evening, I'd like to reiterate the same message that was delivered to me when I began my work on climate change. If we're going to make a difference in the problems that Al Gore has described to us tonight, it's going to be because you all are going to make that difference. Thank you all for coming tonight, and have a great evening.